December 1944th, the Ardennes Forest. The temperature has plummeted to a bone minus, chilling 18 degrees Fahrenheit, and a thick, freezing fog suffocates every inch of the rugged landscape. Emerging from this white abyss is a mechanical nightmare Kampfgruppe Peiper, an elite, heavily armed SS Panzer spearhead boasting 58 armored juggernauts and 5,000 fanatical, battle-minus, hardened troops. They are relentless steel leviathan tearing through American lines. In just 72 hours, they have completely obliterated 3 American divisions, leaving a trail of fire and blood in their wake. Their ultimate prize is the Meuse River, and absolutely nothing seems capable of standing in their way. But here is the most mind-boggling, forgotten truth of World War I. This invincible Nazi armored armada was brought to a dead, grinding halt in exactly 30 minutes. And what stopped them? It wasn't a decorated, veteran armored division. It was 3 pieces of literal junk Sherman tanks cobbled together from a scrapyard, manned by 18-year-old rookies and mechanics who had never fired a main gun in combat. This is the blood-soaked, untold miracle of the 740th Tank Battalion, the Daredevils, a story of how a handful of desperate kids armed with scrap metal broke the spine of Hitler's most terrifying war machine. Our story centers on Private First Class Harry Miller, just 18 years old. At 1:50 a.m. on December 19th, he is shivering violently in the loader's seat of a makeshift Sherman tank near the Stoumont station in Belgium. He is staring into the fog-shrouded highway, his heart pounding against his ribs. He knows the German Panthers are coming. His combat experience is absolutely zero. His unit, the 740th Tank Battalion, commanded by the audacious Lieutenant Colonel George Rubel, shouldn't even be on this battlefield. For 18 grueling months in the Arizona desert, they were trained as a highly specialized night searchlight unit. When that mission was abruptly scrapped in November, the First Army promised them a full complement of brand new M for Shermans by January 1945. War is a cruel master. Instead of a mighty armored force, they were lone 9 tanks for training, only to have them stripped away on December 17th to plug the catastrophic gaps caused by the sudden German blitzkrieg known as the Battle of the Bulge. Left with just 3 pathetic M5 Stuart light tanks and 2 assault guns, facing the greatest German armored thrust of the war was nothing short of a suicide mission. In that moment of absolute despair, a frantic headquarters remembered an abandoned, shot-up vehicle depot in Stoumont. At 12:45 p.m. on December 18th, a seemingly impossible order came down the wire: get to Stoumont, find any armored vehicles you can, and by whatever means necessary, make them run. At 2 o'clock Captain James Berry led Company C into the scrapyard. Miller and every mechanic the battalion could muster rushed into the depot. The sight that greeted them was pure hopelessness. 3 Shermans sat on the ready line, completely gutted of their most critical components. 20-5 other vehicles lay scattered across the yard like metal carcasses, some blown apart in combat, others cannibalized for parts. The original ordnance screws had fled in such a blind panic that half-eaten meals were still sitting on the tables. Miller sketched a diagram of their grim reality. 1 amphibious Sherman was missing its breech block, had no machine guns, and lacked a radio. Staff Sergeant Charlie Luby dug through the rusted junk and stumbled upon an M30 Jackson tank destroyer, a beast he had never laid eyes on, let alone knew how to fire. Others found 2 M24 Chaffee light tanks, a model no one in the entire battalion had ever been trained to operate. Time was evaporating in the freezing night wind, and the Grim Reaper was marching closer by the second. The entire battalion worked like madmen in the pitch black, their hands bleeding and slick with black grease. Miller and his brothers arms scavenged through the graveyard of destroyed vehicles like desperate wolves. Miraculously, they ripped a functional breech block from the charred guts of a dead Sherman. They forcibly tore machine guns from a half-minus track with a shattered suspension. By 2 o'clock a.m. on December 19th, 3 Shermans and that lone M30 tank destroyer were violently resurrected, barely able to move and shoot. Miller's radio shrieked with agonizing static, hydraulic fluid bled from the turret traverse mechanism, and their ammunition consisted of faded, old-minus stock shells. But the order had already dropped 30 minutes prior, move to Stoumont station immediately. Peiper SS Vanguard had just shattered the final defensive line. Just 12 miles west, the 1st Army headquarters in Spa was preparing for a panicked evacuation. Kampfgruppe Peiper was parked just 1 bridge away from the open highway to the Meuse. If Peiper crossed that river, he would slice the Allied lines in two, isolating the British and Canadian forces to the north and handing General Eisenhower an apocalyptic disaster. The only thing temporarily slowing Peiper down was his own ravenous need for fuel. His massive Panthers guzzled gas faster than his supply trucks could deliver it. Allied intelligence screamed that massive fuel convoys were racing from Germany to resupply him. Once they arrived, nothing would stand between the SS and total victory. At Stoumont, the heavily outgunned 1st Battalion of the 119th Infantry Regiment had been digging freezing foxholes into the iron-hard dirt since the 18th. These riflemen knew a devastating assault was coming. They just didn't know exactly when the hammer would fall. At 7 o'clock a.m. on December 19th, German paratroopers and SS Panzer grenadiers slammed into the village just 2 miles east of Stoumont. Accompanying them were the terrifying, shaking Mark V I Tiger tanks. The 119th Infantry fought a brutal room-to-room, hand-to-hand slaughter for every single building. By noon, Peiper owned the village. Major General Leland Hobbs, commanding the 30th Division, was staring at a total collapse. His men had just lost the last defensible terrain in the valley. Only a severely depleted battalion remained at the station. If they broke, Peiper would be dining in Liege by nightfall. This was the inescapable death trap Miller's Frankenstein Sherman was rolling into. Shivering uncontrollably, Miller crawled into his steel coffin at 3 o'clock a.m. The engine violently coughed to life on the second try. The radio spat awful noise, and the main gun traversed ground with a sluggish, sickening delay. First Lieutenant Charles Powers led the 3rd Platoon down the treacherous, ice-slicked highway of the Meuse River Valley at 3:45 a.m. Miller's tank was 4th in line. Hidden in the lethal, blinding fog ahead, 3 German Panther tanks sat in silent ambush, waiting for their prey. Miller had exactly 30 minutes to prove whether 3 junk tanks pieced together in a desperate midnight scramble could halt the most alarmed task force in Nazi Germany. The road was terrifyingly narrow, just wide enough for a single Sherman. A sheer, heavily wooded cliff rocketed 300 feet up on their left. On their right, the deep, raging Meuse River offered a 40-foot drop to a watery grave. It was a fatal funnel. No room to maneuver, no room to retreat. The freezing fog slashed visibility to a blinding 75 yards, and thick ice coated every inch of the tanks. Powers stood exposed in his turret, his eyes straining through the white mist. They crawled forward at a tortuous walking pace. As the pale dawn broke at 6 o'clock a.m., visibility crept up to 100 yards. The road banked sharply right around a massive granite outcrop. Just beyond the curves at Stoumont Station, the strategic choke point of the entire valley. Powers inched his Sherman around the bend. Suddenly, looming 100 yards ahead, sat a lethal German Panther tank, perfectly camouflaged in the brush. Its devastating 75 high-velocity gun leveled dead at the road. The Germans had the ultimate tactical advantage. Any advancing Sherman had to expose its paper-thin-side armor, while the Panther sat safely in a hull-down, virtually impenetrable ambush position. But in a fraction of a second, Power's gunner, Corporal Jack Ashby, unleashed a miracle of reflexes. He fired just milliseconds before the German gunner could pull his trigger. The armor mine a piercing round slammed into the Panther's gun mantle T at a severe angle. Miraculously, the shell deflected downward, violently punching straight through the driver's hatch. The monstrous German tank was instantly consumed in a roaring fireball. The ammo inside began to cook off, the terrifying cracks of exploding shells echoing off the valley walls. For screaming German crewmen bailed out of the inferno, 2 of them entirely engulfed in flames. Powers didn't even blink. He ordered the column forward. Miller's tank rolled past the blazing wreckage, his gun swinging left to cover the tree line where the burning Germans had vanished. They pushed another 150 yards into the mist. At 6:15 a.m., Powers spotted the second Panther lurking behind a stone wall on the left, also perfectly entrenched. These Germans had just watched their comrades burn. They were ready. Ashby fired first again. The round sparked against the Panther's thick, sloped lower glacis, but this time, it simply gouged a deep trench in the steel and ricocheted off harmlessly. Panther's massive turret began its terrifying rotation, locking on to Powers' Sherman. At that exact, horrifying moment, Powers' loader screamed the words every tanker dreads: the main gun was jammed. A spent casing had warped and lodged violently in the breech. Powers was effectively disarmed, sitting directly in the crotcheris of a German executioner. In that split-second between life and death, Staff Sergeant Charlie Luby's M30 Stank destroyer roared out from the 3rd position in the column. Luby had literally found this alien machine in the Scrapyard Scrapyard 18 hours ago. He had never commanded a night-team weapon. His gunner, Corporal William Beckman, had never fired one in combat. But the M30 carried the most devastating anti-mine stank gun in the American arsenal, and the Panther was sitting entirely exposed 100 yards away. Beckman had less than 3 seconds to act before the elite German gunner vaporized them. Trusting pure instinct, Beckman slammed the firing pedal. The massive 90 armor minus piercing shell struck with apocalyptic kinetic energy, tearing through the Panther's heavy frontal armor like wet tissue paper. He didn't stop. He slammed a second round straight through the turret ring. Then, a third. That final shell found the Panther's ammunition magazine. The resulting detonation was deafening. The sheer force of the explosion ripped the multi-minus-ton turret completely off the hull, launching it 6 feet into the air before it crashed back down to the frozen earth, instantly vaporizing the German crew inside. Exploiting the shock, Powers' loader frantically pried the jammed casing free. Lieutenant took a ragged breath and reclaimed the lead. The column ground forward, another 150 yards into the blinding fog. By 6:30, Powers spotted the 3rd Panther. This one was ingeniously hidden in a farmyard on the right, protected by a low stone wall that exposed only its gun barrel and upper glacis. Ashby didn't hesitate. He pulled the trigger. The armor minus piercing round flew true, smashing dead center into the Panther's muzzle brake. The hardened steel attachment disintegrated. The sheer force of the impact sent shockwaves down the barrel, causing the shell to detonate inside the tube. The explosion peeled the heavy German gun barrel open like a metallic flower, razor minus sharp steel petals blooming grotesquely outward. Witnessing this display of impossible marksmanship, the surviving German crew's nerve shattered completely. They abandoned their crippled beast and fled into the woods. Their main weapon was destroyed. The pride of the SS armor was reduced to scrap. Lieutenant Colonel Robert Herlong, commanding the infantry battalion, ordered a halt at 6:35 a.m. In exactly 30 minutes of unbelievable violence, Company C had recaptured Stoumont Station. 3 frontline German Panthers were annihilated by 3 scrap minus yard Shermans and a borrowed tank destroyer. Peiper's unstoppable blitz down the Amble V Valley had been violently frozen in its tracks. But Miller knew in his gut that this was just the opening act of hell. Peiper still commanded 50-5 heavy tanks just 2 miles away in Stoumont village. The German fuel convoys were racing closer. Come dawn on December 20th, the enraged SS would unleash a counterattack with everything they had, and Miller's jury-rigged Sherman would have to hold the line against an apocalypse. Miller spent the first agonizing night at Stoumont Station curled up like a stray dog deep inside the icy belly of his tank. The temperature plunged to 12 degrees. Thick frost coated the inside of the turret. Touching any bare metal with exposed skin meant instant, painful frostbite. Sleep was a physical impossibility. Miller huddled against his loader, hoarding their fading body heat, listening to the horrifying, rhythmic popping of the 3 destroyed Panthers cooking off their remaining ammunition in the pitch black. Past midnight, the rumbling of salvation echoed from Scrapyard. More salvage tanks limped into the perimeter. Mechanics worked by the faint glow of flashlights in the freezing snow, installing radios and frantically bore-sighting main guns. Ammunition handlers worked like demons, passing freezing shells down through the narrow hatches to build up the ready racks. The 30th Division's heavy artillery rolled up close behind them, hacking firing pits into the frozen earth. By the dawn of December 20th, Company C boasted 14 operational Shermans. It was a pitiful number compared to Peiper's 55, but enough to make the SS bleed for every inch. The weather on the 20th was merciless. Sleet hammered down, and the fog once again choked visibility to under 100 yards. At 6 o'clock in the morning, the 2nd Platoon, led by Lieutenant Dave Idogglesby, spearheaded the morning assault. Infantry riflemen crept through the freezing timber to protect the tanks' vulnerable flanks. The artillery opened up with a deafening roar. Their target Stoumont village, 2 miles away. Callaway S. Sherman led the creep forward, every nerve ending screaming, expecting a fatal ambush around every icy bend. The road flattened out, favoring the German defenders. Thick stone walls and ancient farmhouses provided impregnable firing positions. At 6:20 in the morning, Callaway met the devil. A Panther sat cloaked behind a wall, its gun already locked on the road. Callaway's gunner fired a prayer of an armor-piercing shell. In a stroke of divine luck, the round struck the Panther's barrel, the kinetic energy detonating the shell inside the tube, peeling the steel open like a twisted iron flower. The shocked Germans bailed out and ran. Pushing the advantage, the platoon shredded to SS half tracks in the next 10 minutes. Then, at 6:40 in the morning, disaster struck. Staff Sergeant Homer Tompkins' Sherman hit a dense, perfectly concealed German minefield. The first blast shattered the left track, throwing heavy steel links into the air. Before Tompkins could even react, a second mine severed the right track. The Sherman was instantly crippled, blocking the entire advance. Immediately, the hidden German MG-40 machine guns unleashed a torrential crossfire, turning the minefield into a meat grinder. Tompkins kicked his hatch open. Tracer fire hissed inches from his helmet. The crew scrambled out of the bottom escape hatch, diving into the snow as bullets chewed the ground around them. Miraculously, all 5 men survived, but the American advance was completely paralyzed. By noon, after horrific, blood-soaked, hand-to-hand urban combat, the Americans seized the hamlet of Ardennes. Miller's Sherman provided relentless covering fire from behind a stone barn, pumping high explosive rounds into every suspected German stronghold. The continuous firing turned the inside of the turret into a suffocating, corded choke oven. The crew poured sweat despite the freezing weather outside. 17 rounds fired, then 23, then 31. Miller functioned like a soulless machine, ripping heavy shells from the racks, ramming them into the breech, locking the block, and slapping the gunner's shoulder. Fire, reload, repeat. By 3 in the afternoon, exhausted American infantry and armor finally clawed their way to the eastern edge of Stoumont village. They occupied the street. Eduard Sanatorium, a massive, 3-story brick fortress perched on a steep hill that dominated the entire battlefield. Whoever held the sanatorium controlled Stoumont. Peiper knew this. At 11 at night, under the cover of darkness, 50 to 100 fanatic SS Panzer grenadiers launched a suicidal, screaming bands, a charge up the steep slope. They fired Panzerfaust rockets at point-blank range into the brickwork. The American defenders fought like cornered animals, lighting up the night sky with tracers, but they were ultimately overwhelmed by the sheer, psychotic ferocity of the SS. By midnight, the Germans recaptured the sanatorium, driving the surviving Americans back down into the freezing dark. Miller's Sherman was parked directly at the base of the cliff beneath the sanatorium. The severe angle made it impossible to elevate his gun high enough to provide fire support. He sat trapped in the iron dark, listening helplessly to the horrifying sounds of slaughter above, the thud of grenades, the rip of automatic fire, the agonizing screams of dying men. At 4 in the morning, on December 21st, Lieutenant August tried to crawl forward in the dark to assist. Suddenly, the gates of hell swung wide open. A hidden German anti-tank gun barked 3 times in rapid succession. All 3 armor-piercing rounds effortlessly punched through the Sherman's hull. The crew bailed out just as the tank erupted into a towering pillar of fire. In the next 30 seconds, 2 more Shermans were systematically executed. For burning American tanks now completely blocked the narrow road, sealing off the only route for the planned American counterattack. At dawn on the 21st, Lieutenant Colonel Rubel surveyed the apocalyptic disaster. The road was blocked by burning steel. The towering sanatorium was packed with Peiper's elite SS, looking down their throats. The battalion was trapped. Rubel needed a miracle. Spotting a massive, self-propelled 155mm howitzer that had just arrived with the division artillery, Rubel went rogue. Without asking for permission, he commandeered the beast, dragged it onto a hillside overlooking the sanatorium, and personally directed a devastating, point-blank bombardment. He fired 50 massive high-explosive shells, methodically blowing the building apart floor by floor, window by window. The Germans inside were pulverized, yet they fanatically refused to surrender. Meanwhile, Captain Barry devised an insane engineering solution. Under heavy fire, he scouted a sheer cliff face and directed his engineers. They built a makeshift corduroy road out of shattered tree trunks and thousands of empty artillery casings. Under the cover of smoke, recovery vehicles dragged the burning Shermans out of the way. By the first light of December 22nd, Barry had inexplicably maneuvered a full platoon of fully loaded Shermans right up to the shattered walls of the sanatorium. The tanks thrust their main guns directly through the ground floor windows, detonating high explosive rounds in closed rooms, instantly liquidating the SS defenders. Coaxial machine guns swept the rubble like scythes. The infantry charged the front doors with a deafening war cry, while the tanks suppressed the upper floors. By noon, the blood-soaked fortress was retaken. Deep in the dark cellars, the troops found nearly 250 terrified civilians, including children. They had survived 3 days of absolute hell. Simultaneously, Powers and Luby hunted down and destroyed a German Pantherend, a captured American Sherman bearing German crosses. This relentless pressure finally shattered Peiper's spine. His defensive lines collapsed. The surviving SS broke and fled eastward toward Lodge Illy, IZE. The momentum shifted entirely. By nightfall on the 22nd, American forces had pushed thousands of yards through the Stoumont meat grinder. In 3 days of unimaginable violence, the 740th Tank Battalion lost 5 tanks and had 6 men wounded. But miraculously, not a single Daredevil had been killed in the desperate defense. The infantry, however, paid a butcher's bill, 18 dead, 60 severely wounded, and 28 missing. But Peiper's unstoppable advance was dead. His fuel was gone. The American knew Stoumont from three sides, locking the SS in a frozen pocket. By December 23rd, the Americans prepared the final hammer blow on Peiper's last, and in Logie, Ize. Miller had been reassigned to the assault gun platoon, operating specialized Shermans armed with terrifying 105mm howitzers. Their job was to provide overwhelming, mobile artillery support. The 105mm shells were monstrously heavy, draining Miller's energy with every reload. At 9 in the morning, his platoon rumbled toward the Freud-Cour Castle on the outskirts of Stoumont. Just 2 miles away, the trapped Germans were fighting like cornered drats in Logie, Ize. The fearless Colonel Rubel scaled the towering walls of the castle, fully exposing himself to sniper fire, acting as a forward observer. Spotting an artillery crew dragging a 155mm gun, Rubel commandeered them too. Like a mad conductor of a symphony of destruction, Rubel orchestrated the fire of all 6 105mm Shermans and the 155mm Behemoth. Inside the tank, Miller gritted his teeth, heaving the massive shells into the breach, firing blindly at coordinates he couldn't even see. The noise was skull-crushing. Miller's ears bled with a ringing so loud he could barely hear the intercom. For over an hour, they rained tons of high explosives onto Logie, Ize, turning the village into a burning funeral pyre. Staring at the apocalypse raining down on his men, Joachim Peiper finally realized his war was over. At 10 in the evening on December 23rd, sitting in a damp, vibrating cellar in Logie, Ize, Peiper faced complete ruin. 9 days ago, he commanded an unstoppable army. Now, he was trapped with 800 demoralized survivors and 28 useless, fuel-starved tanks. Surrounded by the 119th Infantry, the 3rd Armored Division, and the elite paratroopers of the 82nd Airborne, with American artillery dropping 57,000 shells onto his position in just 4 days, Peiper made a humiliating choice. At 10:20 in the evening, he ordered his proud SS men to destroy their heavy weapons, abandon their invincible tanks, and flee on foot through the freezing night. Men who had brutally murdered prisoners of war and burned villages to the ground were now running like whipped dogs. By dawn on Christmas Eve, the survivors of Kampfgruppe Peiper linked out of the ruins, leaving behind 28 pristine heavy tanks including Panthers, Tigers, and the dreaded King Tiger 70 half-tracks, and over 4,000 dead, wounded, or captured comrades. The elite spearhead of the Nazi offensive had been utterly eradicated by a Scrapyard battalion. On Christmas Eve, Miller rolled into the smoking ruins of Logie, Ize. It was a vision of hell. Crushed buildings, smoldering Tiger tanks, and a heavily scarred church. Exhausted American crews fueled their tanks, while ragged civilians crept from the cellars. But there was no rest for the Daredevils. By December 29th, they were attached to the aggressive 82nd Airborne Division for a brutal clearing operation. Miller lived in the freezing, cramped steel belly of his Sherman, surviving on frozen K rations and learning to sleep while the tank bounced over craters. The rookies fought with such shocking ferocity that an airborne officer wrote in his diary that the 740th was the only tank unit capable of keeping pace with the paratroopers. Through January, they bounced from the 8th Infantry to the 63rd to the 86th. They never rested. They were the constant tip of the Allied spear. Miller's humanity was entirely subsumed by battlefield professionalism. He learned to swallow cold rations while shells exploded yards away. His reloading speed with the 105mm shells became a terrifying, automated blur of muscle memory. In late March, the battalion crossed the treacherous, violently swaying pontoon bridges over the Rhine River to encircle the Ruhr pocket. Miller gripped his hatch in sheer terror as the multi-ton tanks caused the makeshift bridges to heave and sink under the raging current. Days later, they stormed an operational Luftwaffe airfield, unleashing a one-sided slaughter. As desperate German pilots tried to take off, Miller's Sherman pumped high, explosive anti-aircraft rounds directly into the planes. Fighters were obliterated on the runway, others redded just as their wheels left the tarmac. It was a brutal, total destruction of the remaining German air power. By mid-April, the Third Reich was collapsing. The vengeful Soviet Red Army crushed Berlin from the east, while the Allies swept in from the west. Yet, fanatical pockets of resistance fought to the bitter end, and the 740th met them head-on. Miller, the terrified boy from Stoumont, was now a hardened veteran of 120 continuous days of combat. He had loaded thousands of rounds, watched villages burn, and seen the invincible Nazi armor turn to ash. On April 30th, they crossed the Elbe River with zero resistance. The German fighting spirit had finally broken. Racing north, the 740th linked up with the British Second Army near Schwerin. Then, the day finally arrived. May 7th, 1945, Germany surrendered unconditionally. Sitting on the turret of his battle-scarred Sherman, under a bright spring sun, Miller stared out at the Baltic Sea, his mind completely blank. 138 days of relentless, bloody warfare. From having zero tanks to rolling across the entirety of Germany. He looked at his grease-stained, calloused hands. His hearing was severely damaged, but he was alive. The final ledger of the 740th Tank Battalion is staggering. 43 heroes killed in action. 57 tanks destroyed. But in return, these former searchlight operators obliterated 69 heavy German tanks, including 17 Tigers and King Tigers. They destroyed or captured 717 enemy vehicles and annihilated 264 aircraft. They smashed through the Siegfried Line twice. But their crown jewel remains Stoumont, where a handful of broken tanks stopped the deadliest Nazi force on Earth. Captain Barry, Lieutenant Powers, and Sergeant Luby were awarded Silver Stars. Every man at Stoumont received the Presidential Unit Citation, explicitly honoring their miraculous stand with hastily assembled scrapyard equipment. Miller received no major, individual medals. To the Army, he was just a loader. But history knows that on December 19th, when the world hung in the balance, an 18-year-old kidnapped his brothers, rode scrap metal into the mouth of hell, looked the SS in the eye, and broke them forever. If you want more hardcore breakdowns of history's deadliest miscalculations, smash that like button and subscribe.